I thought I'd start off with just clarifying some things, because when we talk about the shoreline and the marina, people say sand on marina. What does the sand on marina really mean to different people? Some people think of just a boat harbor. Others think of the restaurants. I mean, do you think of the Regis Polo site and the golf course as part of the marina? Or how about the San Lorenzo Bridge at the far end right by Orloma? I mean, that's all part of the San Leandro Shoreline Recreation Area. So it's a very large area. And so when we talk about the harbor, I just want to be clear that all we're really referring to is the harbor basin, which is the marina office, the docks, the restrooms, the fuel dock, the boat launch, and the slips themselves. I mean, that's the harbor basin. And the recreation area consists of Marina Park, the parcours, the Bay Trail that goes for 1.5 miles in town. We have hundreds of acres of marshlands, Horatio's, El Torito, the Marina Inn, and of course, fishing piers and open space, and the golf club. So it's a very large area. There's a lot more to it than just the harbor. So, but what we're going to focus on today primarily is going to be the harbor side of it. So let's talk about the harbor. So where did it start? So in 1963, the harbor opened. Can you go back? Here we go. So the first piece that was built was what is now the concrete docks. Originally they were wooden docks that were put in '63. And what you're seeing there is on what formerly was known as North Dyke Road. So that's on the northern portion of the harbor. And then, in 1972, the harbor was expanded to include what is now currently still the second portion. And those are the wooden docks that are still in place now. The next phase was we go back to the original configuration, and the original wooden docks were replaced with concrete docks, which again are still there today. So as it currently sits, we have a total of 259 concrete berths, 203 wooden berths, for a total of about 462. That number varies depending on the size of the boats and how you configure some of the end ties and other areas where you can put multiple boats in some cases you can only put one large boat. So that number is, give or take, let's say 5 to 10 boats, depending on the size of the boats. There's 11 covered berths at the harbor of the 462, and we currently have 38 people that actually live on their boats in the harbor. By permit, we're only allowed to have 45, so we have 7 less than allowed to have. Now this begins to tell the critical tale here of the harbor. Is our current vacancy right now is 62%, so that means of all our berths, over 60% are vacant. If you take a look at the top, it kind of gives you a story of what's going on. As you look at the type of slips and the size of slips, when the harbor was built, most of the slips were very small. Most of the slips were designed to 24, 28-foot lengths. But like, imagine back in 1950, the average home being built, 1960 was what, 12, 13, 14 square feet. Now, the average home being built is 25, 3,000 square feet. Everything has gotten bigger. Our boats are bigger. And so what we're finding is that there isn't really a demand for the small boat slips. But the harbor, quite frankly, was designed for small boats. And the demand just isn't there. The larger slips, like the 60-foot slips, you can see are generally fully occupied. The covered slips are generally fully occupied. But when you get into that 24, 28, 32-foot range, there's just not much demand for those size slips. So there's several things that we need to do if we were to keep the harbor in operation. One, we would have to reconfigure the docks. One was you'd have to take the original wooden docks, or I should say the second phase, the wooden docks that are now well over 40 years old. There's a lot of rot in those docks. They would have to be replaced. And of course, we wouldn't replace them with small slips. We would replace them with larger slips to meet the demand, if the demand was there. The estimates we've gotten from engineering firms, it would cost us $8 million to replace the existing wooden slips with light concrete slips. There's some additional smaller projects that need to be done as a fuel dock upgrade, which we'll talk about in a minute. We need to replace the restrooms on the south side of the harbor that will also have extensive dry rot in our original structures. And then we need access improvements to the marina office that doesn't meet any of the ADA requirements for disability access. So the total for the unfunded improvements right now is $10 million. We took a look at a 30-year cowboy loan. to do all that work, and it's about $614,000 a year in principal and interest payments. So that's a fuel dock. That's the dirt there, or the mud is. I mean, that's a siltation issue, but the fuel dock itself and the fueling system does require some upgrades. Next is this is just a sample of a typical wood dock. You can see all the knot holes have lost their knots, so there's just a lot of things that need to be upgraded and replaced. So the best thing to do would be to either resurface it or, quite frankly, replace it with a concrete system. And then they've actually recently painted the two restrooms, even the one that's been abandoned, just to make it look better. But there's extensive dry rot in these original old structures along the southern portion of the marina. And then there's a marina office. As you can see, that ramp up is very steep, and you'd be taking your life in your own hands if you try to push a wheelchair up that ramp. So this is the first financial table I wanted to show. The Shoreline Enterprise Fund is a type of fund where it's separate from our general fund. When people tend to think of government, they tend to think of the general fund. That's where all your tax dollars generally go. Enterprise funds are intended for specific operations that are trying to operate, quote unquote, like an enterprise or a private business. So the Shoreline combines several businesses that are trying to operate and turn a profit. That includes the golf course, the harbor, and the rest of the Shoreline area is included in that. And that would, in terms of revenue generation, that would include the two restaurants as well as the hotel. That's what supplies the revenue for that part of the operation. So as you can see, the golf course generates anywhere from, and these numbers are actual numbers for fiscal year 2009-10, which we just closed last month. So the golf course generated almost $1 million in revenue. The expenditures, including general fund loan repayments of $307,000 a year, or about $667,000. So the golf course, as you can see, actually makes the city a pretty good chunk of money. And that number includes some fairly extensive capital expenditures at the golf course. So typically the amount of money we make is actually a little bit more than that. But that's a representative number that the golf course does generate a profit. Now the harbor operations, this is one of the lowest years to date. The harbor generated $651,000 in revenue. At its peak, when the harbor was 80% occupied, I went back about 8 years in the data where we had the greatest occupancy as well as the greatest amount of, our birth rates had started increasing at the time too. We generated just over $1 million in total revenues at the harbor. So even at our peak, so to speak, the most we generated was about $1 million, whereas our expenditures as they stand today are about $1.1 million, which includes almost $600,000 in general fund and CalBoat loan repayments. And so for this last fiscal year, the shortfall was about $500,000 from the harbor operation. And then the last piece of the fund is what we call the Shoreline. Again, it's the two restaurants and the hotel, which generated $541,000. Again, as you can imagine, because of the economy, those funds are down. And so we typically, are not losing money, so to speak, on that part of the operation. So our expenditures for all other operations at the Shoreline were $588,000 last year. And again, typically we collect more than $600,000, so we generally are cost recovering for operating the remainder of the Shoreline area. But because of the economy and the loss of revenues, we did actually lose money, possibly for the first time in that side of the operation this last year. So the net for the Shoreline is a $241,000 loss. And the most interesting number, and this is actually 2,000 because we're measuring thousands, but that's going to be the fund balance in the Shoreline Fund at the end of this current fiscal year. So that's the money in the piggy bank when this fiscal year ends June 30th. That's if we spend all the money as budgeted. That's what's going to be left in that Shoreline account. So as you can see, there's no money in that fund for any capital improvements. We're basically, even now, unless our revenues increase a little bit to match where we were a year or two ago, we're actually losing money in our day-to-day operations in the overall fund, which this was the first time I think we've done that.
Do we know how long the Cabo loan is and when would we take the loan out?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have the data here. I mean, they're all 15 to 20 years out. So we've got another 15 to 20 years on average of repayment.
More on Cabo loan?
Yeah, there's multiple loans. This is not one loan. I mean, there was loans taken for the concrete dock upgrades and some dredging and things like that. So there's three or four loans from the CalGov, maturing at different times. Oh yeah, I have all that data. So if you like, I mean, I don't think this is the time to do it, but I have all the data and those interested. I can certainly show it to them. But let's go back to that last slide. The last piece I wanted to show here, and I'm really hesitant to use hard numbers because, as you can imagine, dredging really varies depending on what you do. This last year, when we dredged in 2009, we did a very partial dredge. That partial dredge cost the Corps of Engineers approximately $2 million. Right now, we're estimating $2.5 million to haul those dredge spoils out. So if we're doing just a partial dredge on just the channel, we're looking at spending $4.5 million. Granted, $2 of that million came from the federal government, but there's still $2.5 million that needs to be spent to off-haul the dredge materials. As you can see, our bank account has $2,000. So that's our current dilemma right now, is those materials need to be hauled off within the next year or two, and there is no fund in that account to do that. But the purpose of this is to also illustrate what dredging means. Is I threw a number of $1.5 million per year, because if you dredged everything, you're looking at probably a minimum of $6 to $8 million to do a complete dredging of the harbor as well as a deep dredging of the channel. You're easily spending $1.5 million. You have to set aside $1.5 million a year to have enough money to get that project done. You add that into $614,000, which is that loan we would need to get to take the old wooden docks and convert them to concrete docks. So we would be increasing our debt load and our payment load by over $2 million to pay for those improvements or to keep dredging the harbor. So that's the crux of the conflict we have is how do we fund the improvements, how do we fund the continued dredging from this particular fund. This fund cannot do it as it stands today. There's not enough revenue coming in. This is just a more specific example of what's going on in the harbor itself. The berthing fees are our single biggest revenue, about $500,000. Like I said, at our peak, we generated closer to $850,000 when we had 80% occupancy at the harbor about 5 years ago. We collected about $33,000 in finance charges, fuel sales, utility charges. Newly implemented boat launch fee generated $17,000 last year, and then we sell access keys for and that generated $1,000. So for a total of $651,000. Expenditures, as you can see, our biggest expenditure is debt service. So we've got almost $600,000 in principal and interest payments that have to come out of that fund every year. Salaries and benefits is the next largest item. Overhead is third, and then utilities, repairs and maintenance, supplies, and $6,000 in capital improvements last year for a total of $1.15 million. I know the financials paint kind of a bleak picture of the shoreline fund right now, but I just wanted to assure you that from the standpoint of our operations at our harbor, we're doing everything we can in the shoreline area to keep it up and to improve it and to make it accessible and usable to the public. And I just wanted to list some of the recent projects and some of the upcoming projects that are helping to improve that shoreline area. The fuel dock was resurfaced a couple of years ago. We've done a lot of new landscaping down there. The fishing pier now, that's 2 years old, but that was redone after being closed for a number of years. We dedicated the boat launch and then installed the boat launch fee station. There's been numerous riprap repairs, new entry signs. We've done a lot of paving work actually in the area. And then restrooms and driving range were repainted just last year. And then Marina Park pathways are getting repaved right now as part of the Metro WW. And then next year we anticipate that we'll also be repaving the park course. So there'll be all new pathways and exercise stations in the park course. So even though right now it seems like there's not much money, but with the money that we do have, I mean, we're making every effort to maintain and improve the facilities that we have out there so that the public, because this is clearly our number one amendment in terms of public access and public use. If you go in any day, there's dozens, if not hundreds of people walking the park course and the trail. So we are really focused on keeping those areas up and keeping them accessible so that people can enjoy the shoreline. That's the last slide.